Assalamu alaikum and welcome. I realize that the title of this talk maybe seems rather vague, nature of belief. Let me clarify that now so you don't feel that you came to hear something and it was a different thing they were talking about tonight. By nature of belief, I didn't mean to itemize all the things that a Muslim believes in. Interested parties can find that out for themselves very easily. Go and look it up in an encyclopedia. That's very easy. What I wanted to talk about was belief itself. Is there something different about the way a Muslim believes and the way that somebody else believes? In many cases, maybe there isn't. For example, no doubt there are many Muslims in name, who believe what they believe because their parents believed that way and their parents before them. But especially here in this society now, if a person was born into a Muslim family, he is probably finding himself removed from family, maybe for the purposes of his education. And if he's going to remain a Muslim, he will probably be re-examining, why do I believe the things I believe anyway? And it is in arriving at proper conclusions on self-examination that a person really becomes a Muslim in the true spirit, because the root meaning of the word is submission. That means you have examined something and decided that's where you belong. You want to take a certain position. You submit yourself to a certain position. That is what a Muslim is. So it is on the nature of belief, and you can't separate belief with salvation. So it is on those two things that I mainly want to speak of. Usually in this society, at least Western society, God is thought of as possessing at least three superlative qualities. He is said to be almighty, all-knowing, and all-good. But these three attributes lead to puzzles and paradoxes. Is God helpless to prevent evil, or does he choose not to do so? In the first case, he's not almighty. In the second case, he's not all good. The problem is caused by the ascription all good. Saying that God is all good is an anthropomorphism. That is casting God in the image of man. Good is a relative term. For example, when a lion runs down a gazelle, that's bad for the gazelle. It's good for the lion. Depends on your point of view. Good and bad are a theme of mankind. They are not a theme of the universe. The Quran talks about the good and the evil things created by God. As a matter of fact, so does the Bible. But I've never seen that quoted by anyone who discussed from a Christian point of view the problem of evil, as it is called. From our viewpoint, good and evil are really the terms beneficial and harmful. If you call good and bad as though they were absolute, as though they existed without reference to other things, forgetting their relative nature, you make a serious mistake. It's like calling boiling water hot. It is hot to my fingers, but it's not very hot compared to the surface of the sun. It takes on the quality of being hot only relative to my fingertips. We make a mistake. No physicist would say hot is a thing that has existed from all eternity. It is a basic principle. Temperature is what we talk about. Hot and cold are measures of temperature against something else. In the same way, good and bad is measured against something else. Ethics, the study of good and bad, is like arithmetic, in a sense. If you ask a 6-year-old, why is 2 and 2 4, he might tell you, because the teacher says so. But is that why 2 and 2 is 4? It doesn't depend on the teacher's authority. It depends on facts you can discover for yourself. Similarly, alcohol is not bad because God put it on an arbitrary list of things that he decided to prohibit. It's bad for mankind because it's harmful for mankind. And here's the key point. Man is not punished for his sins. Man is punished by his sins. Evil done brings evil on the doer. The function of God is guidance. Good and bad are pointed out to us, and we may verify the truth of the information by observation and by reason. The Quran repeats the lessons of history. It asks us questions and it answers objections. Salvation is the subject of the 103rd surah, which is usually translated, man is lost except for those who believe and do good and enjoin truth and perseverance on others. 4 points. But let's examine more closely the root meanings of these 4 points. The word translated believe, amanu, has the fundamental meaning confirm or verify. In some cases, the straight path which is sought by Muslims is a result of illumination. If, for example, a creed tells a congregation what they must believe, the congregation should ask for justification, not just sign up. But if the creed says believe such and such, the believer should want to say, why should I? Show me why. The Quran repeatedly warns against believing in something for which there is no warrant. Faith in Islam, then, is not a pledge. It's not a promise to believe something, but it is a conviction. So verification is really the first point of salvation. Now, at this point and some other points, I may get into some things that escape you momentarily or go right by you, but I would urge you to follow through. You can look them up in popular accounts. Check your encyclopedia under references such as logic, or maybe some of you are studying logic and you'll see some of the directions that I'm going in here. Any theory, so we speak about verification, any theory is not infinitely defendable. You cannot keep saying because this, and keep this up forever. Theories are based on assumptions, and one does not prove an assumption, but starts from the point of an assumption. The Muslim's first assumption is simply this: the universe makes sense. And this is the same as the modern scientific assumption. Where scientific disciplines overlap, they have to be consistent. If you have a theory of chemistry and you have a theory of biology, at certain points they overlap. Chemistry is applied to biology and so on. Where they overlap, the two theories that describe both of them can't give an inconsistency. So there must be a bigger theory which takes them all in. And this is the way the scientist reasons. That if he has a consistent theory, he believes it's not going to conflict if it overlaps with somebody else's theory, as long as it's consistent also. The alternative to that assumption, the assumption that the universe makes sense, is chaos. It means that one mistrusts everything. If a person says, no, the universe doesn't make any sense, a man is really saying, I can't be certain of anything. So we want to ask that man, can you be certain of that? You see the trap he's in? If a man wants to mistrust everything, then he has to mistrust his mistrust. And he's paralyzed. He doesn't make any progress. So the first assumption seems to be an option that doesn't really have an alternative. So it's not really an option. Interestingly enough, two of the attributes of God, as described in the Quran, are always put together. Al-Wahid al-Qahar, the one, the compelling, and the irresistible. This assumption that the universe makes sense is really the same as the foundation of Islam. La ilaha illallah. There is no God but the God. Ilah is translated God. La ilaha illallah is saying there is but the one Ilah. If God is a difficult term for people because of its connotations, translate ilah however you will. Ilah is that which ultimately influences events. It is the most basic and the universal constraint. The assumption of consistency is a constraint. It's a restriction, just as the principle of the conservation of matter and energy is a restriction. There's no proof of it, but it is an assumption and a restriction made on all physical observations, the belief of the physical scientist. La ilaha illallah says of this ultimate reality that there is one such reality, and there is only one such reality. We assume the principle of at least one when we say the universe makes sense, and then we realize that, well, if there was more than one, the universe wouldn't make sense either, because overlapping theories would be inconsistent if they were under different initial constraints. Suppose some scientists believed in magic and in whimsical gods that acted however the mood would strike them, so that today you combine hydrogen and oxygen and you get water, but tomorrow you mix hydrogen and oxygen and you get peanuts. Would a scientist who expected the universe to function that way make any kind of progress? Could he be successful? As the Quran says of believers, they are the successful, muflihun. The punishment of polytheists, those who believe in many gods, is expected by Muslims not because there is a jealous God who takes the insult very personally and he'll get you for it. The punishment is expected because it's still another example of being punished by your sins, not for your sins. A man does strange things to his mind when he believes in many gods. He hurts himself. We deal with life according to what we've been convinced of, and life leads to death. We have to live without knowledge. And what happens to the ego, the consciousness, the intellect, me inside? What happens in dying? It must depend on what has gone before, whatever that experience is like. Is it frightening or is it peaceful? When senses are cut off and mental activity has a final burst, and there can be no doubt that it does. Now we're talking about electrodynamics and collapsing electrical fields. There is a burst as the brain dies. What's it like? I won't speculate, but we do know that false hopes will be dashed. If one believed without justification that there existed a God who treated us in such and such a way according to what we believed and how we behaved, one is due for disappointment in the extreme if you were misinformed or misdirected. Now to the second point, as I said, man is lost except for those who believe and do good. Amalu salihat. The root meaning of the word salahah indicates really being useful. And this should be an obvious prerequisite to avoid being lost. To say that a man is not useful is to say that he has not realized his potential. Unless you do what you are capable of, you've lost something of your humanity. And the finish of your human life is going to be something less than the finish of another human life. Another human who made more of his human life. Albert Schweitzer said that he found God within himself as the stirring of ethical will. In other words, he knew what he could do, and he did it. He left behind him the comfort and the riches and the fame that was a sure thing in Europe when he was a young man. He left that behind him and he moved to a leper colony in Africa, where he continued to study and write and help the lepers, and he lived into his 90s. He realized his potential. Now, psychologists could tell us, no doubt, plenty about those who think they are happy, they're comfortable, but they face anguish from inside themselves. What kind of shape is their intellect taking under this kind of torture? People who have convinced themselves they're happy, and they're not really. They are doing less than they could have done. What's it doing to their minds? As to those who make the most of their abilities, here is how God acts in the world. He acts indirectly. The Quran talks about taqwa, usually translated as God consciousness. A man with taqwa has his mind on the absolute as a reference point. His mind is not fixed on what is relative. He's not worried about money or clothing or various other things that depend on other things themselves. His mind is fixed as a reference point on what depends on nothing, the absolute. And then God moves people. Not like we move a checker on a board, like that, but he moves people the way that the goal at the end of the soccer field moves the soccer team. That team will battle away. Does the goal reach out and pull them this way? No, but it's out there. And by keeping an eye on that, that's where they're heading. Indirectly, they are moved by that goal. And here's where we are led to deal with another concept of God, another item in belief. Common practice divides reality into the natural and the supernatural. And occasionally God is thought to interfere with the natural order, reaching down from the supernatural, and he works a miracle. This kind of miracle is really a monster. It's not the same kind of a miracle as the miracle of a beautiful sunrise, or the miracle that a spot as small as a speck of dust can grow into a human being. That's a miracle. But this miracle that interferes with the natural order, that's a whole different thing that people are thinking of. To me, it's a monster. By all means, there are remarkable things that Muslims are ready to believe in. They're ready to accept. But they are things that are accomplished not by a suspension of the natural laws, but by an unusual application of the natural laws. The Quran explains that when God wills something, he simply says to it, be, and it is. Is this hard to understand? Can the saying be the doing? In fact, we deal this way ourselves. Some say always. Suppose I say to this man, I congratulate you. When did I congratulate him? In what way? Did I tell him about something I was going to do, or I did? The saying was the doing. I congratulate you. I did it when I said it. Or if I say to this man, I appoint you as my representative. When I said it, I did it. It's not a difficult concept to understand that the saying can be the same as the doing. This is God as Baruch Spinoza understood him about 300 years ago. The will of God, he said, is no more and no less than those things which take place in the sense of physics. This is why we can say all things originate with God, but we bring evil on ourselves. For example, the chemical reactions between cigarette smoke and human lung tissue are natural law, but the smoker brings the damage on himself. Spinoza said there is but one infinite item, and that only is logical. If it's infinite, there can't be room for two of them. He said there is but one infinite item, and whatever the attributes of that item are, we can only know about two of them, extension and thought. He meant that we know the physical universe and we know how it works. This is the same as the Quranic ascription of Allah as al-Zahir al-Batin, the evident and the immanent, or the external and the internal. This means that the universe and how it functions is all we know of God. The same verse also describes Allah as source and goal, al-awwal, al-akhir, the first and the last. Two attributes that seem to be opposites, and yet they are really just two different viewpoints of one reality. And let me continue with that thought. I'm talking here a moment ago about God being everywhere, in the sense that as the universe performs, that's the way He wishes it to perform. His will is the same as the functioning of the universe. From another point of view, we could say God is only rarely present. Only sometimes is He present. And by this I mean He is present where a man has taqwa, where a man has really attained a constant awareness of God as a reference point. Something remarkable happens. It's where God puts in an appearance. Whether that man be a Jesus Christ or Albert Schweitzer, if their mind is fixed on the absolute, they become a remarkable kind of individual. So then, to avoid being lost, in every sense of the word, it is necessary to verify things and to take appropriate action. These are the first 2 points. The last 2 requirements parallel these, because knowledge and action, in order to be meaningful, must be effective. They must accomplish something, or they don't really mean anything. So as we acquire knowledge, we aid others to do the same. And as we do well, we help others to do the same. So possibly the 103rd Surah, Surah Al-Asr, is more significantly or alternately translated as, man is lost, except for those who verify things and realize their potential and confront others with reality and encourage others to persevere. Now, we've dealt with translating a short chapter of the Quran, a book which is said to be a revelation. This word revelation is a problem for many because it has connotations of sacred mysteries beyond the limits of knowledge. The point is that Muslims believe God to be unknowable in the first place. The Quran does not reveal God. It reveals His will. Now to another topic concerning belief. If you'll have time, we'll go to the blackboard, and as I say, if I lose on something, I encourage you to look it up for yourself and look it over to see that I do, after all, know what it is I'm talking about. The topic is proving the existence of God. The rational arguments, those who would prove the existence of God, the rational arguments can usually be put into one of 3 categories: the ontological, the cosmological, and the teleological arguments. And without dealing with them right now, I can tell you that they are all faulty. They don't prove the existence of God. The arguments were demonstrated to be faulty more than 200 years ago, at least, if not 800 years ago. But they continue to be used. You will still see them printed in abundance, one of these 3 arguments. In the first place, the project which attempts to prove the existence of God is self-contradictory. God is said to be absolute, which means He depends on nothing. Proving His existence means we make some more basic assumption and we build up to God, in which case God fails to be absolute. He depends on our basic assumptions, you see. So it's a foolish kind of a project in the first place. You assume you have an absolute, and then you go ahead and try to prove it, and you undo your definition. One produces a proof for a theorem which says it doesn't have a proof. God is not a theorem based on some assumptions. Rather, God, the absolute, is a necessary item to complete our picture of reality. More accurately, I mean to say that if we make the assumption that the universe makes sense, then we simultaneously acknowledge the singularity in the scheme, which is the absolute, that which is independent of the total concept of the scheme. And there are 2 ways of seeing this. They are the results of the work of a 20th century mathematician by the name of Kurt Gödel, and you can look him up for an account There are popular books on the subject. The Scientific American did an article on him a few years ago. In 1931, Gödel, it's G-O-D-E-L, came up with two theorems that really shook the world of philosophy, logic, and mathematics. I won't explain them in great detail, but I'll try to give you the import. Remember that theories are built on assumptions. So one might think that if we made enough assumptions, then we could go ahead and decide the truth or the falsity of every statement. But an interesting thing happens in logic. Too many assumptions, to start with, produces a logical system that is self-destructive. You've heard of the man who says, "I've invented the universal solvent," and his friend asked him, "What kind of a bottle are you going to keep it in?" That's what happens to logic. If it's capable of solving anything, it will dissolve itself. A logical system which has universal application, in other words, that you can apply to any question and decide is it true or false, is self-destructive. And I can illustrate that by just having you consider this sentence. This statement has no proof. If you can prove that statement is true, then you have a contradiction. On the other hand, the only way to show that it's false is to prove that it's true. Another contradiction. This statement has no proof. If you can prove that statement is true, then you have a contradiction. On the other hand, the only way to show that it's false is to prove that it's true. Another contradiction. So you have to leave it alone. I am imagining, of course, that the statement, that difficult statement, is written out in symbolic logic, which has certain initial assumptions and rules. In order to avoid that contradiction, being able to prove a statement that says it doesn't have a proof, you have to go back to your initial assumptions and remove one or two or three of them, so you don't have a complete list. This was called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. In other words, in any scheme, any theory that you set up, your initial assumptions have to be incomplete. Because if you have a complete list, by that I mean a list that will let you prove anything, it will be the undoing of the whole system. The whole thing will fall down. But then if you're missing some assumptions in the first place, it means that the totality of reality is not knowable. You can never know all the truth. All of the truth is not solvable or soluble. Logic is a solvent, but we need a bottle to keep it in. We need something that it won't dissolve in order to keep the universe making sense. The root meaning of absolute means that which is not dissolved, absolute. Reality, seen through logic, scientific inquiry, is something like looking at an item with a magnifying glass. As you move the glass closer, the image gets bigger and clearer, and you see more details, but you reach a certain point where it's as fine a picture as you're going to get, because if you move any closer, the image is distorted and you've lost it. So to go back with where I started, La ilaha illallah, or the assumption that the universe makes sense, is exactly the same. It's all tied in with the assumption that there is an absolute. There is something that isn't knowable. If the universe makes sense to you, you are at the same time saying there is some item that I do not have a hold on, that is outside of what I do know. You have to admit that in order for your universe to make sense. The other theorem of Gödel concerns consistency, and here we need to think about how it is we think. I hope I don't lose you here. If A and B stand for statements, this means that A implies B. Suppose A is the statement, it is night, and B is the statement, it is cold. Then this statement is saying, if it is night, then it is cold. All right? The way we think is according to the rule of detachment, which says that if this statement is true and this statement is true, then B is true. That's how we think. In other words, if it is true that when it is night it is cold, and if it is true that it is night, well then it's cold. That's how we think. That's the rule of detachment. This statement, this is a statement A, saying it is night. This is the opposite. Not A, it is day. This whole statement here, not A implies that A implies B, is what is called a tautology. Now, a tautology is something that is true no matter what the values of A and B are. In other words, that statement on the right there is true whether or not A is true or B is true, whatever they are. That statement will always be true. You can calculate it out for yourself by considering all the alternatives of putting down, suppose A is true and B is false, then the value of the statement on the right is false, but then A on the left is true, or false, and false implies false is a true statement. You see, with all possibilities, that statement will always be true, and that's a tautology. Now suppose somebody has a theory that is inconsistent. By inconsistency we mean when two opposite things are both true. Well, a very funny thing happens if you want to admit to your scheme of reasoning an inconsistency. The two opposite things are both true. Because if you do that, you can prove that anything is true. You know that this statement is true, always true. Suppose this one, not A, is true. Since not A is true, we can detach it. And we're left with this statement. A implies B, and it is true. That is the rule of detachment. That when this is true, and this is true, we can detach that, and this is true. Now, since this is true, and our friend with the inconsistent theory says, not A is true, but A is true also. The opposite, it's true also. That means we can detach A is true, then we have proved that B is true. You see? The danger being then, if you have a theory that's inconsistent, a theory that contains two opposite things and they're both held to be true, you can use it that way and prove anything is true. If you believe that it is night and it's day too, then you can prove that giraffes are born with two heads. Because those are the rules. The point of it is, first of all, to advise you, that's the danger of an inconsistent theory. A person can use it to prove anything. But the point is, if you have a theory and you want to know if it's consistent, there's one way to find out. That's to produce a statement that has no proof. Because if the theory was inconsistent, you could have proved it. If you come up with a statement that has no proof, it meant, well, there's no inconsistencies in your system because there's no way I could juggle a proof out of this thing. This is why a man cannot consistently build a case that there is no absolute. Plenty of people say that. It's a way of life. To a lot of people, say all things are relative. If they try to build a consistent logical case to demonstrate to you that all things are relative, they can't do it. Because when something is consistent, you have to have an absolute in the system. It also explains why the absolute must be ineffable, unknowable. Because this absolute that you're talking about, which is a necessary item in any scheme of thinking, has to be, by definition, something that isn't defined in your system. It's outside your system. You can't know it. So then the beginning of wisdom, to this Muslim and to many I trust, is the discerning between those things that are relative and that which is absolute. The intelligent man is the man that knows the difference between something that really only depends on something else and something that depends on nothing else. If a man puts his faith in money or fame or some other item, he's fooling himself if he doesn't stop to think, wait a minute, money. But money depends on certain other things, the economy of the country, which depends in turn upon the state of peace worldwide, etc., etc. He's put his faith in a relative thing. The man whose faith is in the absolute isn't subject to wavering and change, because nothing affects the absolute. It doesn't depend on something else, how things are going. The certainty of La ilaha illallah, the certainty that there is no God but the one God, is the same as the assumption that things do make sense, there is an absolute, is a certainty that resides in here. It's in the intellect. The certainty of La ilaha illallah, this certainty that there is no God but the one God, is the same as the assumption that things do make sense, there is an absolute, is a certainty that resides in here. It's in the intellect. It isn't something that we had to look at on the outside and see the evidence for it. We figured out on the inside that there is an absolute. And that's the security, the safety that a Muslim has in his belief. Because he measures what he sees on the outside against what he has on the inside. As someone has said, the devil can imitate a miracle, but the devil cannot successfully counterfeit truth. The devil can make a very impressive show of something, the man was saying, and if your faith is based on miracles and wonderful events that happen outside your body, you can be misled, because people can imitate those things. But the devil cannot imitate the truth to you, because when he tries to, it won't hold together. There is only one truth. You find that if you have in your mind the clarity of an absolute, a measuring standard. The nature of the Muslim's belief, then, is verification. All of the input, ears and eyes, all of the input is measured against the standard of consistency. If someone wants to convince him of something, he has to judge for himself. Does that make sense? What are its implications? Does it cause me some difficulty? Logically? God is the absolute, the point against which everything then is measured. As the 112th surah reads, قُلْ هُوَ لَهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. Say, He is Allah, unique. Allah, the absolute. He did not father, nor was He fathered, and there is nothing that can be likened to Him. In conclusion, let me say it is gratifying to see interested people here. It means for those interested people that you cared enough to listen for yourself and not be satisfied with a second-hand report of activities. Many books, it has been calculated at least 50,000 books in the last 100 years have been written against Islam. But they all fall into one general category, and they continue to fall into one general category. The fallacy of argument is called, usually, straw man. Instead of confronting the truth of Islam, these books fashion an opponent for themselves out of straw, and then they beat it to death. Instead of facing this Muslim over here, they piece together a Muslim of a quote from what some Muslim said here and somebody else in here, and they put together a Muslim, and they build him over here, and then they look very tough and they beat him to pieces. But that's not the real Muslim. You know, he was over here. That is, they put positions in the Muslim's mouth which he never meant to say, and attack those and demolish them, and that looks very impressive, but it isn't what Islam is all about. So I would encourage individuals who are interested to continue to go to the source. You want to know about Judaism? Go and listen to the rabbi. You want to know about Christianity? well, listen to the Christians. If you want to know about Islam, listen to the Muslims. By all means, you might want to see what the Christians have to say about the Muslims and what the Muslims have to say about the Christians, and that's another topic too. But the point is to go to the source and to measure things in your own mind. Does it make sense? If something bothers you, is it because I told you something wasn't true? Or why does it bother you? Think about it. Measure it against the absolute, the power of the intellect. This is how man is saved. Those conclude my comments. I see we have, I guess, about the amount of time you expected. Do you want to just entertain questions now, or what did you have in mind?